John had always been an adventurous soul, eager to explore every corner of the world. His latest journey brought him to London, a city steeped in history and adorned with timeless beauty. As he wandered through the bustling streets, his eyes sparkled with excitement at every historical landmark and cultural icon he encountered. The crisp, cool air of early spring added a fresh zest to his step as he made his way toward one of the city's most famed attractions, the Royal Palace. The palace, a magnificent structure with centuries of history echoed in its grand halls and stately gardens, was a sight to behold. Tourists from around the globe milled about, cameras ready, capturing every moment of their visit. John mingled with the crowd, his heart swelling with the thrill of standing so close to the heart of British royalty. As he approached the stoic, red-coated guards standing at their posts, John recalled numerous online videos he'd watched where tourists attempted to make the guards laugh or simply get them to react. The guards were famous worldwide for their disciplined, unmoving stance, no matter what antics unfolded before them. In a moment of reckless curiosity, spurred on by the playful chatter of a group of tourists nearby, John wondered what it would take to get a reaction from one of these guards. The group joked about how funny it would be if someone could actually get a guard to break his composure. Caught up in the jovial atmosphere and the challenge, John momentarily forgot the respect and decorum such a situation demanded. He stepped closer to one of the guards, a young man about his age, whose eyes were fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable behind the tall black bearskin hat. John waved his hand lightly in front of the guard's face, eliciting no response. The tourists around him chuckled and egged him on. Emboldened and a bit misguided by the crowd's encouragement, John lightly tapped the guard's arm, hoping for just a slight flinch, something to laugh about later. Still, the guard remained impassive, the very image of dedication and discipline. Feeling the pressure to impress his fellow tourists and fueled by an increasing desire to push the boundaries, John made a decision that would soon turn his lighthearted adventure into a grave situation. With a smirk and a glance back at his audience, he reached out and gave the guard a playful slap on the shoulder, expecting nothing more than a moment of shared laughter. The silence that followed was chilling. The smile fell from John's face as he realized the severity of what he had just done. The guard snapped into motion, signaling for security as the area quickly became tense. John's heart sank as he was promptly detained, his brief moment of folly spiraling into a nightmare. As he was led away, the reality of the consequences began to settle in, overshadowing the excitement of his London visit with a heavy cloak of regret. As John was led away by the palace security, the seriousness of his actions started to hit him. Around him, the crowd's laughter had died down, replaced by murmurs of concern and disbelief. Cameras that had been capturing moments of joy were now focused on him, recording a scene that would soon become much more than a mere holiday mishap. John felt a sinking feeling in his stomach as he was escorted through a series of secure doors, away from the public eye. The interior of the security office was stark and professional, a stark contrast to the historical opulence just outside its walls. John was asked to sit in a small bare room with nothing but a table and 2 chairs. The door shut with a decisive click, and he found himself alone, his heart pounding in his chest. After what seemed like an eternity, but was only a few minutes, a security officer entered the room. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern face, sat down across from John and began to explain the gravity of the situation. He informed John that touching a royal guard was considered a serious offense, especially when done so disrespectfully. John tried to explain his actions as a mere joke, influenced by the playful atmosphere and the behavior he'd seen promoted online. However, the officer was unyielding, making it clear that such behavior was unacceptable and not taken lightly in this context. As the officer laid out the potential consequences, John's initial confusion turned to fear. The reality that he might face legal charges seemed incomprehensible. He was a tourist, after all, and his actions, though foolish, were not intended to harm or disrespect. Yet here he was, possibly facing a charge of assaulting a royal officer, an offense that carried severe penalties under local law. Meanwhile, outside, the news of the incident began to spread. Tourists who had witnessed the event were posting videos and comments on social media. The narrative varied wildly, with some sympathizing with John's mistake as a misunderstanding of cultural norms, while others condemned the disrespect shown towards a royal institution. The rapid spread of information only added to the urgency of the situation, as officials were keen to manage the public reaction and maintain the dignity of their protocols. Back in the security office, John was given the opportunity to contact his embassy for assistance. Feeling isolated and overwhelmed, he made the call, his voice shaky as he tried to explain his predicament to a consular officer. The advice was straightforward: cooperate fully and hope for leniency given his status as a foreigner unaware of the full extent of the laws he had breached. As he hung up the phone, John was left to ponder the swift turn of events that had transformed a day of sightseeing into a daunting ordeal. He realized that what started as a moment of light-hearted fun had escalated into an international incident, pulling him into the depths of a legal and cultural quagmire that he was wholly unprepared to navigate. John sat in the small, windowless room, his hands clasped tightly together as he tried to process what had just happened. The excitement of the morning felt like a distant memory, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The security officer had left him alone for now, but John knew this was far from over. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had never imagined that a simple mistake, a playful moment gone too far, could land him in such deep trouble. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. The quiet hum of an air vent was the only sound in the room. Then the door swung open, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside. One of them, a tall man with a serious expression, motioned for John to stand up. "You are being taken into custody for questioning," he said in a firm but calm voice. John's mouth went dry. "Wait," he stammered. It was just a joke. I didn't mean to cause any harm." The officer remained unmoved. "You assaulted a royal guard, sir. This is a serious offense." The word assault hit John like a punch to the gut. Assault. That word made it sound like he had attacked the guard with intent to hurt him. He wanted to protest, to explain that it was nothing more than a lighthearted moment gone wrong, but he could tell from the officers' faces that they had heard all the excuses before. Without further argument, John allowed himself to be escorted out of the security office and into the waiting police vehicle outside. A few onlookers stood at a distance, whispering among themselves, while others had their phones out, recording every moment. John looked away, embarrassed and anxious. He had come to London to make memories, but not like this. The ride to the police station was silent except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. John stared out the window, his mind racing. Would he be fined? Would he be sent home? He couldn't imagine that they would actually keep him in jail over something like this. Once they arrived at the station, John was led inside, where he was fingerprinted and had his photograph taken. The entire process felt surreal, like a scene from a movie he had never expected to star in. Afterward, he was taken to another small room, this one with a long table and a camera set up in the corner. Across from him sat another officer, who introduced himself as Detective Collins. "Let's go over what happened," the detective said, opening a file in front of him. "Tell me, in your own words, what you were thinking when you hit the guard." John swallowed hard. "I wasn't thinking. I didn't think it was that serious. I thought they weren't allowed to react. I just got caught up in the moment." The detective studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We hear that a lot," he said, "but that doesn't change the fact that you broke the law." John felt his heart sink as he realized that no amount of explanation could erase what had already been done. He was in real trouble now, and he had no idea how bad it would get. John sat in the cold interrogation room, his nerves frayed as Detective Collins continued to flip through the file in front of him. The silence in the room was deafening. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. He had never been in trouble with the law before, never even received a parking ticket back home. Now he was sitting in a foreign police station, facing charges that sounded far more serious than he had ever imagined. The detective leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "John, I need you to understand something," he said. "This isn't just about what you thought was a harmless joke. Here, the Royal Guards are not just ceremonial figures. They are part of the country's military. Harming or even touching them without permission is seen as an attack on the monarchy itself." John swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I swear. I just—" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I got caught up in the moment." The detective nodded slightly, but his face remained serious. "Intentions don't change the law. The authorities take this very seriously. You're officially being charged, and this case will be taken to court." John felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "Court." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You mean I have to stand trial?" "Yes," the detective confirmed. "Given the nature of the offense and the attention it has already received, this won't be handled with just a fine or a warning." John's hands trembled as he rubbed his face. This was supposed to be a vacation, a break from everyday life. Now he was looking at legal battles in a country where he didn't even fully understand the laws. Just then, another officer entered the room and handed the detective a document. He glanced over it and let out a sigh. "John," he said, looking back up, "your case has already caught media attention. Footage of what happened has spread online, and people are reacting strongly." John's stomach twisted. Strongly. He had a feeling that wasn't a good thing. The detective nodded. "Some are calling for strict punishment, saying this is an insult to the country's traditions. Others think it was just a tourist's mistake. But the fact that the public is involved means the court will have even more pressure to make an example out of you." John's head dropped into his hands. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was becoming bigger than he had ever imagined. A few minutes later, he was taken to a holding cell to wait. The small room was empty except for a bench, and the walls seemed to close in on him. He had no phone, no way to contact anyone, just his thoughts, growing heavier by the second. As he sat there, he realized one painful truth. A single moment of foolishness had changed his life forever. And now, he had no choice but to face the consequences. John sat on the hard bench inside the small holding cell, his mind racing. The cold walls around him felt unwelcoming, and the dull hum of distant voices outside only made him feel more isolated. He still couldn't believe how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Just hours ago, he had been a carefree tourist, walking through the streets of London, taking pictures, and enjoying his trip. Now he was sitting in a jail cell, waiting for his fate to be decided by a court. He rubbed his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His embassy had assured him they would provide legal support, but they had also made it clear this was not going to be an easy case. The charges were serious, and with the media already involved, the government would be under pressure to make an example out of him. That thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard stories of people getting caught up in legal trouble in foreign countries, but he never imagined he would be one of them. A loud metallic clank snapped him out of his thoughts. The cell door swung open, and a uniformed officer stood at the entrance. "You have a visitor," the officer said. John felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was someone from the embassy. Maybe there was good news. He stood up quickly and followed the officer down the narrow hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. When he entered the small meeting room, he saw a man in a formal suit sitting across the table. He had a briefcase in front of him and a serious expression on his face. "Mr. Carter," the man said, addressing John by his last name, "I'm your appointed defense lawyer. My name is Mr. Hayes." John sat down, gripping the edges of the chair. "Please, tell me there's a way to fix this," he said desperately. Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "I'm here to help you," he assured John, "but you need to understand something very clearly. This is not a minor situation. You are being charged with assaulting a royal guard, which is a serious crime here. The prosecution will argue that you intentionally disrespected a military officer." John shook his head. "But it was just a mistake. I didn't mean any harm." Mr. Hayes sighed. "Intentions matter very little in court. The law is clear. The prosecution will push for the maximum punishment to show that the country will not tolerate disrespect toward its royal guards. We need to focus on a strategy that might reduce your sentence." John's throat went dry. "Reduce my sentence?" He felt his stomach twist. "You mean I'm definitely going to jail?" "There is a strong possibility," Mr. Hayes admitted. "But with the right defense, we might be able to argue for leniency." John leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. This wasn't just a bad vacation story anymore. It was real, and it was terrifying. The trial was coming, and he wasn't ready. The day of the trial arrived faster than John expected. His nerves were on edge as he sat in the small, cold courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to begin. The room was quieter than he had imagined, with only a few people present, mostly legal officials and some journalists sitting at the back, whispering to each other. John couldn't help but feel a heavy weight pressing down on him as he thought about the trial ahead. This was his chance to explain himself, but the fear of what might happen next made it hard to think straight. Mr. Hayes, his defense lawyer, sat next to him, flipping through some papers with an expression of deep concentration. "Remember," he said quietly, "stick to the facts. Explain that this was a misunderstanding. Show remorse for your actions, and hopefully the court will see that you didn't intend any harm." John nodded, though he wasn't sure how much that would help. He had made a foolish decision, one that had quickly spiraled out of control, but now he had to prove to the judge that he didn't deserve the harsh punishment he was facing. The judge, an elderly man with a stern face, entered the courtroom and motioned for everyone to rise. The proceedings began with the reading of the charges against John. The words "assault on a royal guard" echoed in John's mind as the prosecutor laid out their case. They presented the video footage of the incident, showing John slapping the guard's arm. It felt like the whole world was watching, and John could see the seriousness in the judge's eyes. The prosecutor argued that what John did was not just a simple mistake, but a deliberate act of disrespect toward an important symbol of the nation. "This behavior cannot and should not be tolerated," the prosecutor said, his voice firm and confident. The defendant's actions were a direct challenge to the authority and dignity of the royal family. John's heart sank. It was hard to argue against the footage. It was there for everyone to see. His one moment of poor judgment was now at the center of everything, and the law didn't seem to care about his intentions. When it was finally time for John's defense, Mr. Hayes stood up and approached the judge. "Your Honor, my client understands the gravity of his actions and deeply regrets the mistake he made. He comes from a different culture, and he was unaware of the strict laws regarding the royal guard. This was never meant as an act of disrespect, but as a misguided attempt at humor." John felt a small sense of hope as Mr. Hayes continued, but he knew the path ahead wasn't easy. The prosecutor had already made it clear that they would push for the maximum penalty, and the media's attention on the case only added pressure to the already tense situation. John couldn't help but think about how his life had changed so drastically in just a few short hours. As Mr. Hayes made his closing arguments, John's mind wandered. What would happen if the judge didn't believe his explanation? What if the media's opinion swayed the court's decision? He had to stay calm, but the fear of what might come next lingered in the back of his mind. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was steady and strong. "The court will deliberate and return with a decision." The room fell silent, and John could only wait in suspense, knowing that his future was now in the hands of a system he barely understood. The hours seemed to stretch on forever as John sat in the small, dimly lit room, waiting for the court's decision. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the incident over and over again. He couldn't shake the image of the royal guard's face, stiff and unmoving, as he had made that one impulsive mistake. The courtroom had been full of people, some sympathetic, others less so. The pressure of it all was becoming unbearable. John's thoughts were interrupted when the door opened, and Mr. Hayes walked in with a grim expression on his face. John stood up, his heart beating faster. "What happened?" he asked, his voice shaky. Mr. Hayes took a deep breath. "The court has reached a decision, but it's not exactly what we hoped for. They're going to convict you, but there's still a chance for leniency." John's stomach twisted. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're offering a reduced sentence. 5 years in prison," Mr. Hayes said. "But we can appeal. The case isn't over yet." John sat back down, his mind trying to process the news. 5 years. That was longer than he had ever imagined spending in a foreign country. His trip, which had started with excitement and wonder, was now overshadowed by the looming reality of a long prison sentence. He couldn't fathom how this could happen to him. "But there's more," Mr. Hayes continued. "Your family has been notified, and they've already started trying to get in touch with the embassy. They're working on an appeal, and we might be able to get you out of here sooner than expected." John's mind barely registered the words. His family. The thought of how they would react to the news made his heart ache. He hadn't meant to get himself into trouble, and now he was stuck in a legal nightmare with no clear way out. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. As Mr. Hayes spoke about the process of filing an appeal, John's thoughts drifted to his family back home. He could already picture the look of shock on their faces when they heard the news. How would they react? Would they be angry with him for making such a foolish decision? Or would they be concerned for his safety, not knowing how the situation would play out? Before he could dwell too much on those thoughts, Mr. Hayes stood up. "I need to get started on the appeal right away. The sooner we act, the better your chances. Don't lose hope, John. This isn't the end of the road." John nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. As his lawyer left the room, he was left alone once again, his mind swirling with questions. Could the appeal actually change anything? Would he be stuck in this foreign prison for years to come, or would he be able to return home soon? The next few days would determine his fate. But for now, all he could do was wait, and hope that the legal system would see his case in a more forgiving light. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and constant waiting. John spent most of his time in his small cell, trying to stay calm as he thought about the appeal. His lawyer, Mr. Hayes, had been working tirelessly to gather all the necessary information to present a stronger case. But every time John thought about the situation, his mind raced. How could a single mistake lead to this? He had only wanted to enjoy his time in a new country. And now he was stuck in a foreign prison, fighting to avoid a sentence that could last 5 long years. Every few days, Mr. Hayes would visit him with updates, though the news never seemed to be as positive as John had hoped. The process was slow, and it felt as though the system was working against him. Despite the mounting pressure, John tried to stay optimistic. He reminded himself that his family was working hard back home to make sure he wasn't forgotten, but the feeling of isolation was overwhelming. Without being able to see them or speak to them directly, it was hard to know if things were really improving. One afternoon, as John sat on his bunk, staring out through the small barred window, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He turned around to see one of the guards walking toward him, holding a phone. "You've got a call," the guard said, his tone softening a little. John's heart skipped a beat. A phone call. He hadn't had one in days, and the last time he'd spoken to anyone was when his lawyer had explained the process of the appeal. He hurriedly stood up, walking toward the guard. The phone felt strange in his hands, almost like a lifeline, something he hadn't realized he desperately needed. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky. "John, it's Mom. came the voice on the other end of the line. Her tone was warm, yet filled with concern. "We've been in contact with the embassy, and things are moving. I know this has been so difficult for you, but we're not giving up." John felt a wave of relief wash over him as he heard his mother's voice. It had been so long since he'd heard anything familiar. "Mom, I don't know what to do. I'm so sorry. I never thought it would go this far. I didn't mean to." "Shay, we know, sweetie," she interrupted gently. "I know this was a mistake, and we're working to fix it. The embassy is doing everything they can, and your lawyer is fighting for you. Just stay strong, okay? We're with you, and we won't stop until you're back home." Tears welled up in John's eyes as he listened to her words. It had been so hard not being able to speak to his family, to hear that everything was okay, but now it felt like a tiny light at the end of a long tunnel. Hearing that they were fighting for him, that he wasn't alone, gave him the strength to hold on for just a little bit longer. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to cause all this trouble." "You didn't cause trouble, John," his mom reassured him. "You made a mistake, and now we're fixing it. You'll be home soon, I promise. Just hang in there." As the call ended and John handed the phone back to the guard, a sense of calm settled over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he knew he wasn't fighting this battle alone. His family was with him, the embassy was working hard, and there was still hope. John lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't predict what the future would hold, but he was determined to stay strong. His journey was far from over, but with his family's support and his lawyer's determination, he believed he would eventually make it through this. And as the days passed, things slowly began to change. The appeal was gaining momentum, and though it wasn't over yet, the possibility of a reduced sentence was becoming more real. John wasn't sure when he would be free, but he knew that with each passing day, he was one step closer to finding his way back home.